Hi, so this is my attempt at presenting my lesson to you without actually being there. And the lesson for today is, were our businessmen of the Gilded Age robber barons, or were they captains of industry? One of my favorite political cartoons is that one on the top. If they are indeed robber barons, you have all these different laborers from different backgrounds and cultures bowing down to the very few businessmen who are controlling everything. They've created monopolies, and they are also controlling legislation, as you can see is written on the sword on the gentleman on the right. Or should we give these folks the benefit of the doubt and consider them to be captains of industry? During this presentation, you can take notes. You should be able to take some notes and pause if you need to. So here's some evidence that these gentlemen may indeed have been captains of their own industry. In what ways were these industrialists good for America? In a lot of ways, these industrialists gave back to the very communities in which they lived. That is called philanthropy. When you are so wealthy that you can give away some of your wealth, that is philanthropy. Vanderbilt did. He gave away $1 million for the construction of a university, which to this day is one of the most popular of the private universities. His remaining fortune, $95 million of it, he willed to his son to carry on the business. So $1 million of his $95 million he gave away. $500,000 to each of his other 9 kids and a wife. Must have really liked his son. Carnegie also, probably of all of them, was known for giving away most of his wealth, an equivalent of $80 billion today. He also wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth. And the Gospel of Wealth, to this day, is considered one of the most important essays of the time. You can see that it wasn't written until 1889 at the end, really, of this Gilded Age, or toward the end of the Gilded Age. But the Gospel of Wealth to Carnegie meant that if you were fortunate enough to own so much of the nation's wealth, you actually had a responsibility to give part of it away to the community. Rockefeller gave away more than Carnegie, gave it to education, the arts, medical advancements. His name is on several important buildings and businesses across the nation, from Chicago really to the East Coast. And then J.P. Morgan, he bailed out the government on a couple of occasions, as we chatted about last class. But he was also the leading donor for art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as the American Natural History Museum. So maybe these guys were indeed captains of their industry, helping their community. Great political cartoon. This is supposed to be Carnegie really creating an opportunity for the library to exist. Or were these gentlemen robber barons? In what ways were these men creating monopolies at the expense of laborers? As we talked about last class and in your presentations, they were most definitely in charge of the nation's wealth, but they were also in charge of what the nation was going to produce at the time, which was going to be railroads, steel, oil, which really led to the need for the progressives you portrayed last class. Wouldn't have need those progressives and more democracy and working conditions and muckrakers had they not been robber barons. Great political cartoon, and how as robber barons they definitely had a lot of control over the nation's legislature. All those big guys on the right-hand side are your major monopolies on copper, steel, even things like coal and sugar, definitely Standard Oil, which is your third large fellow from the right. And all of the little guys there, that's your House of Representatives, or that's your Senate, all of your senators making decisions clearly controlled by the money that is dangled in front of them by our robber barons. As robber barons, they created the need to regulate those monopolies. If we believe that they were truly great industrialists, we would have let them have their monopoly. But we saw that as a really negative piece because as a monopoly, maybe they were preventing new technology and new ideas from developing. So the Supreme Court got involved with Wabash versus Illinois, and the Supreme Court said that Congress does have the power to regulate interstate commerce, which meant that Congress did have the ability to break up a monopoly. In modern form, Congress did go after Bill Gates and held a trial for Bill Gates and found that, yes, indeed, he had a monopoly and had to give up some of his ideas to others. Also, in regulating trust, you did have Congress come forward and they passed the Interstate Commerce Act as well as the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Interstate Commerce Act is definitely used for things like the railroad and shipping industries, but the Sherman Antitrust Act is what is known more widely. Definitely not enforced by President McKinley. That's why President McKinley is considered to be the president who was bought by our monopolists. But William Howard Taft as president and Theodore Roosevelt both brought in the Sherman Antitrust Act to really start breaking apart the monopolies and create a larger opportunity for competition to exist, which would then end in lower prices. Also, if we consider these guys to be robber barons, that was the need for unions to develop. These are our two unions that were the most popular unions. The Knights of Labor, created by Terence Powderly, included any skilled, unskilled women, African Americans, probably the most widely used union. And they pushed for an 8-hour workday, better work environment, didn't want children to be involved in the railroads. The Knights of Labor was very successful until they had a strike, which resulted in a massive riot in Haymarket Square, Chicago, brought a lot of negative publicity to the Knights of Labor and unions in general. And the second biggest union was probably the American Federation of Labor, had about 500,000 members, and these guys really focused on just skilled laborers and tried to get these skilled laborers higher wages for the most part and shorter hours and better working conditions. The end of these unions, or I guess probably the biggest controversy of these unions, was that these unions did promote strikes. So people walked off the job in some pretty major events. One was the railroad. And when the railroad stopped working, the nation stopped working. You also had the Pullman strike of 1894, which was also part of the railroad in the company towns. Really incredibly violent to the point where President Cleveland had to send in federal troops to stop it. And then the coal strike, which for a short amount of time created a lack of coal being brought to homes and businesses. And you can imagine that if that's your biggest form of energy, that had a pretty major impact. Another great political cartoon in regard to the Pullman strike, that you've got high rent and low wages, but do you squash the people who are protesting those low wages and high rent? Or do you listen to them at the expense of trying to increase the cost of your product and decrease the amount of money that the monopolist may get? So, are they robber barons or captains of industry? You have two tasks. I want you to watch The Men Who Built America. It's a link on Schoology, and it is part 3 of the series. And number 2, I want you to work with your peers to organize evidence to answer the questions, were these people robber barons or captains of industry? And that's a packet that you will receive And I look forward to hearing your answers. Have a great day.